Welcome to Ideas of India, where we examine the academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Today, my guest is Ashwini Deshpande, who is a professor of economics and the founding director of the Center for Economic Data and Analysis at Ashoka University in New Delhi. She's also the author of the books The Grammar of Caste, Economic Discrimination in Contemporary India, and The Short Introduction to Affirmative Action in India. We talked about caste and gender discrimination in India, the relationship between merit and affirmative actions, or reservations as it is more popularly known in India, the low and declining female labour force participation rates, Indian cinema, Lata Mangeshkar, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Hi Ashwini, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to have you here.
Hi, Shruti. It's a real delight and an honor to be on the show because I've been following it. You do such excellent, fantastic interviews. So really delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I want to start with your book, the main work on discrimination relating to caste and gender. So you're an economist. So, in the standard neoclassical economics, the canon is the Gary Becker model of economics of discrimination from like the 57 book. And the idea is that, firms and employers that do discriminate in the market on grounds that have nothing to do with productivity will bear a cost of discriminating in the market, right? And this doesn't mean that there is no discrimination in the equilibrium outcome. It just means that people who choose to discriminate will pay a cost for doing so. And that cost may or may not be large depending on, cultural and other circumstances. And furthermore, that market competition will therefore make it more costly to discriminate and hopefully reduce these kinds of discrimination which are not related to productivity. How does this play out in India? Especially with caste discrimination and gender discrimination, which have some overlap but can still take quite different forms.
Gary Becker's theory of taste for discrimination, so it's taste-based. And even though there's a cost associated with discriminating in a market setting, the reason that economic agents discriminate is because it's a part of their tastes and preferences. So even though it's couched in neoclassical terms, and obviously it's a neoclassical theory, it's very much, monetary equivalent of the taste for discrimination, I think that it does capture what in other words we call prejudice. In other words, if you really have a strong taste for discrimination, you don't mind paying the cost for it. And in India, we see examples of that kind all the time where you would say, I'm not going to go to a particular area to eat, for example, or to get my car serviced, or I won't look for a house in that particular neighborhood, even though it might be actually cheaper for me to buy something in that neighborhood because I don't want to live next to these neighbors or anything like that. And the car service example is a very real one. People might choose a car service that's more expensive rather than go to a cheaper one, which makes economic sense. So they are bearing a cost. And I think individuals do that all the time. Having said that, in the neoclassical canon, there's another theory of discrimination, which is not taste-based, it's statistical. And the real challenge in the literature on discrimination is how do you distinguish between taste-based and statistical? And I don't think that there is a 100% clear answer to that. And I think both things happen. We see examples of stereotypes about women or people from certain parts of the country or certain caste groups, which are articulated very effortlessly by people in India, as it is fairly untouched by political correctness, in large parts of the country. Is that taste-based discrimination? Is that statistical? Some of it is obviously taste-based, but some of it is statistical as well. So empirically or theoretically to distinguish between the two channels, theoretically is easier to distinguish. Empirically, to distinguish between the two channels is not that straightforward.
In India, given how fractionalized our interactions are based on caste, do people really face a very competitive market when it comes to indulging in their prejudice?
By that, do you mean are markets competitive enough that they will drive out people, let's say employers who are discriminating? Is that the question?
Well,
Or
employers, but also something like, say, the housing market, right? Now, technically, you are paying a price when it comes to, let's say discriminating against someone because they eat meat, which is again a very caste-based and religion-based preference, right? Or prejudice in certain circles. But the housing market is really not that competitive. It's not easy to increase the supply. It is highly ghettoized for other reasons, right? I mean, there are various other reasons other than eating meat that certain groups will not be allowed in a particular building. So are they really, are most of the landlords really paying a price for their discrimination? Or is the price they are paying capture the full amount of discrimination? Maybe that's the other way to ask the question.
no, because it's so ingrained in their tastes. In principle, they could find a tenant that would pay higher. So if you just think of price as in just the monetary equivalent, they might be paying a price. I mean, we don't know that because we don't know the counterfactual. So it could well be that if there's a reshuffling, there would higher paying tenants might be matched with employers, with landlords who are looking for higher rents and so on, right? But if a landlord's aversion to meat eating is extremely strong, then the question is not really the price that they are going to get for their apartment. What matters really for them is to get a tenant who doesn't eat meat in their apartment. That is
Yeah.
a very important factor in their calculations. So I think what Becker's theory made us aware of is the fact that it's not always the monetary amount of that transaction that you see as the price, the monetary price of the transaction. All of these factors go into, it's like going into defining what the price feels like. It's, I always give my students this example of the weather app on our phones. It says 16 degrees feels like 12, and it really feels like that's what it feels like. That's the, so this is what Becker pointed out towards as the sort of monetary equivalent of the taste for discrimination. So if a person ate meat in my apartment, and if I had a very strong aversion to meat eating, even though that person might be giving me, let's say, 50,000 rupees a month as rent, to me, the act of my apartment being defiled by meat makes my rent feel like 30,000
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
whatever it might be. And really, then it's really the 30,000 that's entering my calculation. I mean, and in Becker's model, that's exactly what happens, which is you literally adjust the price by the discrimination coefficient, and every individual is rationally aware of each of our millions of discrimination coefficients that we possess. And obviously, that's not the way the real world functions, but the hatred can be, or the aversion for a particular feature or a practice or a group could be strong enough that it factors into your monetary calculations. We focus on the pecuniary, but what we need to realize is that discrimination shapes our feels as if, that
Yeah.
that kind of a factor.
Yeah. So, here now I want to move a little bit away from the housing market and let's say move to the labor market. When it comes to caste discrimination, there are multiple problems. One, of course, is just plain prejudice, right? The other is the consequences of historical oppression on building of human capital. And the Becker model is basically talking about the kind of discrimination which has nothing to do with productivity. But in caste discrimination, there's an element where the prejudice or the discrimination affects productivity, and there is an additional discrimination other than affecting productivity. What does the Indian landscape look like when it comes to these two aspects of discrimination?
So, here I'd urge you to move a little bit away from Becker and towards Arrow and statistical discrimination, because, Arrow most elegantly showed how statistical discrimination can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, if there is a group that believes that they are not going to be eligible for higher quality jobs, and if it is costly to invest in human capital to be eligible for those, it works backwards, and you don't actually invest in the human capital because that you're not going to recoup those costs. And I'm talking now, strictly as an economist. So the employer's beliefs about the lower productivity of a group becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So effort goes down because you know that you're not going to be rewarded for that effort. Now, listeners who are listening at this moment might say, oh, you're talking too much like an economist. Nobody thinks like this. But when you think about girls, for example, if the cues that girls are given from childhood is that, don't go in for certain kinds of professions or play with dolls, or, girls are sort of nudged towards the more housekeeping kinds of, or caring, nurturing kinds of games and options, they're less likely to go into occupations or streams of education that are not geared towards for them to fulfill those roles. So when the landscape or values or social norms or cultural ethos of a particular society builds in unconsciously into our own expectations and into our own, what we see as our roles. And it may be directly parents telling children don't do this or that, but it also could be just internalization at a subconscious level by a whole variety of actors, such that it results in a situation where girls are likely to choose pink and play with dolls and less likely to do STEM or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So employers can turn around and say, see, we told you, we don't have enough girls who are scientifically trained, don't have enough women applicants who are scientifically trained. But that process started. So the state of the market, labor market, that gives out certain signals that go all the way down. And those signals then become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I find Arrow's statistical discrimination theory really powerful here in terms of explaining how a cultural ethos affects choices and outcome at a much early on in the pipeline. And so yes, there is a pipeline issue for sure.
This is where I find some of your work on affirmative action very interesting, because what you find is that despite the fact that there is so much stigma and prejudice that, a lot of the beneficiaries of the reservation programs in India face, especially, the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe candidates, they don't choose to drop out of those benefits, right? They actually still engage in everything that needs to be done to pass those exams, to get into those educational institutions, regardless of the consequences. And there are consequences on, self-esteem and mental health and so many other consequences, right? Like they don't apply the same way in the private sector market as their, non-affirmative action counterparts and so on. Is it that affirmative action can bridge this gap or break the link with the self-fulfilling prophecy? Is that how I should read this work? Or is the way to read the work that for certain groups, in particular Dalit Adivasis in India, the disadvantages due to historical oppression are just so great that stigma is not going to be the relevant hurdle that keeps them behind? The benefits of getting out of their traditional occupations is just too big to be deterred by some kind of stigma or prejudice.
Both of these. So
Okay.
you've hit the nail on the head. So the this is what I always say when people talk about the stigma of reservations or stigma of affirmative action. Of course, there's been excellent work in the United States on this. Most famously, the book "The Shape of the River" by Bowen and Bock. And so they show how, despite facing microaggressions in Ivy League universities, when African American students who got admitted on affirmative action, when 10 years down the line in their lives were much more, at a much higher, on a much higher trajectory, socioeconomically speaking, compared to their peers who didn't get into these Ivy Leagues through affirmative action, and compared to their previous generations. So if you ask them, would you rather not have been a student at Yale or Harvard because you faced those microaggressions or stigma and had a very different, noticeably life with poorer socioeconomic outcomes, or are life is about trade-offs. And, in fact, their interviews, they record that any day the beneficiaries of affirmative action are happy with where they were at that stage in their lives relative to not having been given this chance at all. And in my paper with Catherine Newman, where the path leads, we find exactly the same thing. We interview students who got into three universities which at that point, when we did this study, were the sort of top universities in India: Delhi University, JNU, etc. And students openly told us about how they would not dream of any other life, even as they told us that in the university, they did face discrimination, microaggressions, discrimination, not being invited to people's homes, or a separate seat in the hostel where food was being served, etc. So all of these stigmatizing instances did occur. But, as I keep telling my students, is these individuals come from groups or communities that are already highly stigmatized. So to think that by not getting reservation, their stigma is going to be any less? I mean, they are the most stigmatized groups in India today. I mean, what are they losing? If anything, they're going to gain. And there is now ample study that shows of the immense benefits of getting reservation. That's one. And the other is, of course, it breaks the stigmatizing association between being Dalit and being educationally backward or being considered incompetent. Just today, I had lunch with a couple of colleagues, and they were asking me about B.R. Ambedkar. Having somebody like Ambedkar be a student at LSE shows you what's possible, you know, and it holds an individual role model, but it also shows the possibilities that can take place. Of course, Ambedkar focused a lot on educate, agitate, organize, etc. Things subsequently have not been so straightforward. It is not straightforward that if you educate yourself, automatically hurdles in later life are going to disappear. Unfortunately, we are not there yet, but certainly that's the first step. So, having reservation, I think it's a very important policy that allows us to break the stigmatizing association between belonging to a particular group that is stigmatized for its supposed lack of competence, which has only occurred because the caste system kept education away from certain groups consciously. You know, that was a part of the caste code. So it wasn't as though, you know, Dalits were incapable of getting an education, they were denied education. Having educated members of your community then allows for those stigmatizing associations to weaken. Having said that, of course, it's not a cakewalk and it's not straightforward, the transformation.
But here I want to also get into the question of merit. So, there are two very typical sort of, I want to call this like the upper middle class and upper caste critique of reservation, right? So one is the stigmatization, which is very almost paternalist, right? And the second is one of merit, right? Somehow this sense that those who are getting, these jobs or these educational institution admissions because of affirmative action, they are not as meritorious as the candidates who are in the general category. Now, I don't know if this was ever true, and maybe it was in the very early years of the Republic. We've had litigation to prevent SC/ST candidates from coming into the general category because their exam scores and sort of, civil services scores are often good enough to qualify them in the general category, right? Now, they may be outliers. So what is the relationship between merit and affirmative action? Is there any... is it anything other than sour grapes and we couldn't get into these schools kind of, upper middle class critique? Or is there something here that, there's genuinely a big gap in merit and that actually gets bridged through the education process or through the job skilling process?
This is a long question that has answers that I have answered in several parts. So let's just first understand the role of the cutoff. The way the admissions take place to many universities is there is a cutoff score. So 80% is the cutoff. If you have 80.1, you get in. And if you have 79.9, you don't get in. That's how it works. That while the cutoff is seen as an indicator of merit, it's really a market clearing mechanism. It's just a cutoff is a number that arises when such that the number of entrants to a college is equal to the number of seats that are vacant. So if there are 100 people applying to 100 positions, everybody gets in. If there are 1,000 people applying to 100 positions, 900 will not get in no matter what. And as you can see, as the number of positions is fixed and the number of applicants rises, the cutoff is going to keep rising. So first of all, it's just literally a market clear. It's a price that equates demand and supply. So that's one thing. The second thing is that when you look at the results of the competitive exams, whether it is the class 12 exams, whether it's the MBBS, engineering college entrance exams, the numerical marks that students have been getting have been widely increasing over the decades. I got 80% in my class 12 exam, which for my time was considered a really good score. Today, 80% is nothing. I mean, people will say you barely passed. Now, today people are getting, 99, 100%.
Great inflation.
Great inflation, right? So what we really want to do is a relative ranking, right? That's what is happening when admissions are going on. Now, it is true that the cutoffs for reserved category students are lower. But for caste categories, the difference in the cutoffs is announced publicly. We know the gap between the last general categories student who got in, the SC cutoff. These are public in the public domain. I'm not saying it's insignificant, but it's well known and it's transparent. A slight digression to my answer is that India also has a lot of other quotas, notably something like a management quota or something where in private engineering colleges, parents can give a donation and somebody gets in. Those cutoffs, I don't even know if there are any cutoffs there. So we always have, in this merit argument, we always forget to talk about graduates who got into a college on all of these very opaque and non-transparent quotas. The first point is that yes, there is a gap in the entry scores between the general category and the Dalit students. However, when after you take admission, there is a process of 2 to 4 to 5 years, depending on what course it is, after which you graduate. And to think that somebody who was at, say, a particular position at the time of entry will always remain at that position at the time of exit is not true at all. So just because somebody entered with a lower cutoff, which is well known, to assume that they will always remain lower at the exit point is incorrect. It may happen.
Yeah.
Because to believe that a complete catch up can happen in 2 years where there's been historical disadvantage of so many prior years is a little bit over optimistic. And so maybe they will graduate with lower scores as well. We don't have good data on the entry scores and the exit scores correlation. And that is not very strong because when I was at the Delhi school, I had done some back of the envelope correlations between entry and exit scores. Those were not strong. Okay. Finally, the real question is one that has actually been examined in a paper by Marianne Bertrand, Senthil Mullainathan, and Rima Hanna, where they have looked at a shape of the river kind of thing, where they've looked at the position of affirmative action beneficiaries 7 to 10 years down the line. And in that paper, they got data on general category students who were displaced by reservation. Take 100 seats and 1,000 applicants, 900 are not going to get in anyway, even if there was no reservation, right? And so supposing 22 seats are reserved, then only 22 general category are displaced. So in this paper, they are able to identify the actually displaced students. They look at the outcomes of those displaced by reservations 10 years down the line, and they look at the outcomes of displacing students 10 years down the line. And they find that those who got displaced, their occupation and income levels were not significantly lower than their parents or their peers who got in. In other words, they landed on their feet. Those who displaced, in other words, the affirmative action beneficiaries, their occupation and income outcomes 10 years down the line were significantly higher than their parents and their peers. Moral of the story is that reservations help the beneficiaries much more than they cost the losers from reservations. Any policy has gainers and losers.
Fair.
And reservation is no different in that regard. But I think the benefits to those who benefit are far greater than the presumed losses to those who lose out. Because the presumed loss is literally, I didn't get into this college. That's it. But I'll land on my feet. I'll do something else.
Here, I want to get into a couple of things. So one is I didn't get into this college that is given a certain amount of supply, right? And to me, I feel like a lot of this grouse against the reservation policy from the general category students who are mostly upper caste, I think it is rooted in the fact that our education system has not scaled with population. Right? The size of the pie has simply not grown. So what ends up happening is the reservation becomes a very easy target for people who presumably worked pretty hard, most of them, right? And then there is this huge sense of unfairness. So one very simple solution, I feel, is just increase the size of the pie. I mean, we could have 1,000 more engineering colleges. We could triple the size of each IIT and still produce very high quality students, because the intake of the students would still be excellent. And of course, you need to invest in the infrastructure. But to me, it seems to be a supply side problem, which has squeezed human capital formation in a particular way and which may be leading to adding to the prejudice and discrimination that people face in society. Is that a good way to think about what's happening in India?
To a large extent, yes. But, Shruti, I think I'll just add one qualification to what you said, which is the supply of good quality educational institutions. So, the length and breadth of India, you find these sort of teaching shops that have mushroomed without any regulation, without any attention to quality, curriculum, etc., etc. Now, students study in them. You see large numbers of students, but they're not regulated, no idea what's being taught there. And that's why the good quality institutions become so coveted, the IITs or the IIMs, or Delhi University in its heyday, and so on and so forth. And it really boils down to the priority that I think as a nation we need to give to education. And over there, it's always, economists are very fond of putting primary education in contradistinction with higher. So whenever anybody talks in favor of expanding higher education, they say, no, 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 but we need to focus on primary. And I've always wondered why we need to do either or. I think there is a big demand for higher education. And while the expansion of primary and the strengthening of primary needs to go on simultaneously, we need to focus on high quality higher education. You're right. I mean, a lot of this grudge is because there are few spots and competition is intense. But, for that reason, I just want to say one more thing, which I wanted to say earlier in response to the merit question, is that actually competition is intense also for the reserved categories.
Yes, exactly. That's what I find so incredible about this merit conversation.
When you hear the merit conversation, or especially in, sort of popular debates, it seems like literally somebody walking on the street can just walk into an IIT. That doesn't happen. Even for reserved category, the rejection rate is very high, while the SC/ST cutoffs are lower than the general category. But there is intense competition even within those categories. So it's really so if you think of cutoffs as any indicator of merit, then we have the best of each category.
You're absolutely right. There's fierce competition in every category, and we're getting the best of each group. And even if there are some gaps between the best of each group, that gap should narrow, right, over 4 years of education or 3 years of education. Now, one of the interesting things about people from the reserved categories is they tend to have sort of worse options or a worse chance in the private sector than the public sector. Now, of course, some of this is because public sector jobs are specifically reserved for them. But some of this is also because private sector jobs are so network-based in India, and you need to come from particular neighborhoods, speak English in a particular way, right? Come from particular families and have, certain references and so on. So how much of the affirmative action candidates' success in the private sector market is because of this historical disadvantage, and how much of it is because the gap between their levels and the general category levels didn't quite completely bridge over the 3 or 4 years of education? This seems to be a thing that keeps popping up, that if they're so good, why aren't they doing so well in the private sector market, right?
I think it's both. And I think there is one paper that finds that they continue to play catch up. I think it's based on one of the engineering colleges. And while that paper gets cited as sort of some sort of a proof that reservations are not so good after all, to my mind, even if you find that the gap sort of remains, or it's very hard to measure, first of all, and how do you even measure that gap? But anyway, especially when you have streams and you have different options that students take, etc., it's really hard to measure. For argument's sake, let's assume that the gap remains the same, which is hard to measure, and it's hard to believe also. The way the question should be framed is not so much as did the gap narrow, because I don't think that's the right way to assess the success of reservations. Because I don't think the success of reservations is that in a college, in a course, the gap has to narrow. That may or may not happen, right? I know that wasn't your question, but that's a very common thing that's asked. What's the point? They're going to remain at the bottom of the class, etc. I know that you didn't ask that question, but I'm it's answering it anyway, because it's a question that comes up a lot. What happens in the job market after the degree is a combination both of the possibility that the gap never closed, as well as the cultural deficits that mark of many students who come in on reservation, which these cultural deficits have their history in the early life, like what economists call pre-market, right? And unless you have a very strong bridge programs, conscious attempt to equalize a certain kind of, cultural capital that you need to succeed in the labor market. These gaps are not going to bridge just by studying a particular course. For example, I'll tell you from my experience at the Delhi school, is that when the private sector employers used to come to recruit, they would have a group discussion, which was basically students sitting in a room where this person from the Citibank or whatever is there. The person is asking a question and you have to quickly respond very smartly in English. It's hard. It's hard even for, I thought of myself in those settings, and I probably will take a long time to answer the question. Whereas what they're expecting are these pat 1 minute answers to these questions. So I'm not saying that it's only hard for reserved category students. I'm sure that it's hard also for many general category students who don't have the cultural privilege of having studied in the super fancy English medium school that gave them all this, references, cultural expression, smartness, debate, somebody who's been a debater, etc., etc. All of, that confidence that comes with all being any of these. So I found that a lot of reserved category students opted out of the placement cell at the Delhi school. They didn't even become members because they didn't want to face the group discussion. How did I find all this out? When I was working on my paper, Where the Path Leads. And so I used to ask them, did you join the placement cell, which is a voluntary activity? And they said, no, we didn't, because we didn't want to be in this group discussion scenario. And that's an elimination round. So if you don't perform well in the group discussion, you are eliminated. And they just didn't want to face the possible humiliation of not performing well. So the private sector, as you very rightly say, relies a lot on networks, relies a lot on, markers of smartness, where not just students from stigmatized caste groups, but also rural students suffer a lot.
And people from small towns,
small
there are a whole bunch of markers. Yeah, women.
Markers, women, not all women, I would say, but some women. It's a lot about, what you're wearing, you conduct yourself, and, casual references to something or the other that reveals your class status and so on and so forth. And there are, as you know, India is have several axes of disadvantage, and reserved category students definitely have a lot of those disadvantages from earlier life. And that's hard to overcome in a 2, 4, 5 year course. So it requires a lot of sensitization of the employers also, So I don't think college is going to be sufficient to bridge these kinds of gaps, certainly not.
I also feel like more than the broader discussion of affirmative action and how we think about different groups, and catch up, there is a particular problem with the absolute top levels, whether it's the private sector or whether it's the state. It's been captured by one kind of group that thinks of success in one particular way, right? Successful people speak English like this, right? They watch these shows, they listen to these bands, they went to these schools, and they live in these neighborhoods, right? Pretty much all of the caste narrative in India is at some level played out through networks. Whether we're talking about how can they enter a private sector, high end of the private sector kind of job, whether it is people coming out of rural employment and getting into urban employment in the informal sector, like whether it's construction, whether it's people moving to cities and they're finding a place to live in the slum, everything is based on caste networks in India. Is the reason for persistence of caste networks the fact that India doesn't have any other kind of safety net? Is it the substitute for that? Is it because India is so strongly endogamous?
I think it's both marriage and employment. Because, as you say, and caste, we have, of course, been talking in terms of administrative categories of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, etc. But caste is really jati, so all the way in which, rural migrants to cities or getting a construction job or, what we call thekedars, the contractors, they are recruiting on jati at the jati level, not because these administrative categories don't mean anything in that space. They apply only to the public sector. And it's really a defining feature of most Indians' lives, And so even when students such as the ones I teach say, oh, well, we don't really think about caste because it doesn't really matter. But, I say, well, what about your marriage? How will you marry? And so it doesn't even occur to them that there's a problem that you advertise, or look for a match using your same jati, that it's perpetuating the jati network. Because at the end of the day, it can help you find a job as well, just as it can keep you away from certain jobs. But it could be, you might get stuck at a low level, but what are the options then? I won't say comforting is probably not the word. I'm trying to think of what word it is, but it basically is a social insurance, is a kind of a social insurance, which is not necessarily a good equilibrium because it can keep you trapped in a very low level, low productivity, exploitative, non desirable situation.
But it helps them deal with volatility. Their lives are very precarious, right? So here the question is, what would be the policy intervention that could solve something like this? Is it an insurance program? Is it an unemployment insurance program? Is it a universal basic income? Like, what is the social safety net?
I think a combination of things. I can't think of a single policy that single-handedly will substitute. Because at the end of the day, networks matter everywhere. I mean, they might be different kinds of networks in other countries, but today, Boris Johnson just resigned as a Prime Minister of UK, and there's been so much discussion on this sort of elite boys' club that he and his ministers ran in the US, everywhere. So I mean, it would be totally. I mean, it's certainly, I can't even think about it, but it's certainly utopian to think that India would be that exceptional society that will transition out of networks, because networks matter everywhere. The question is, should jati be the defining feature of those networks? And I think that is not a desirable outcome for a very large number of jatis. Also, it also promotes mediocrity if you belong to the right kind of jati, because just by virtue of being somebody's son or daughter, you will get certain benefits, whereas you may be completely unsuited to getting those benefits, right? So it doesn't just affect quality by not recognizing the merit of those who are at the bottom or are excluded, but it also rewards mediocrity. So there's also an overpayment to certain members of the upper caste, just as there's an underpayment. I'm talking about as a labor economist, and so I think that doesn't make for a very dynamic and efficient society. So I would say a bunch of different things where the labor market needs to be made genuinely meritocratic. I mean, people oppose reservations because they think it's anti-meritocratic, and the assumption is that in the absence of reservations, our labor markets are meritocratic. They're anything but. So I think that working on what would make for genuinely meritocratic labor markets, which are compatible with reservation, I'll argue. Universal basic income could be one component, but that's just a small part of what people need for sustenance. And also, you think of the old style welfare state. What did you, when you fell ill, when you needed food, libraries to go to, or parks to play in, or any of these things, all our social needs, where are they? How are we fulfilling them? Do we have a society in which there is a sort of a neutral provision of services and facilities that fulfill our social needs as human beings? If the only people I visit are my kith and kin, my caste members, that's my network. Then I need that. I need that for survival, for feeling like a member of society, right? And so I think when you think of all of these different dimensions, then a set of policies, but all of that has to be preceded by recognizing that reliance on caste networks is not making India efficient.
Yes, or free.
Or free.
Yeah. For me, I think the worst thing about jati-based labor markets as a social insurance or something like that is the consequences on women. Everywhere else in the world, which didn't exactly have India's caste system, but every society was stratified and had classes in some way. As the structural transformation was taking place in society, right, those break down. And in India, whether India's moved from colonial government to, an Indian government, despite the fact that there are constitutional rights, despite liberalization, exogamous marriages are only hovering at about 5 to 6%. They've always been stably hovering at that level. There's no movement. So to me, that is the most shocking thing about what's happening, that an endogamy is the control over women. I see all this conversation about we must smash the patriarchy and all of that. But in India's annihilation of caste and annihilation of patriarchy in India is pretty much like, it's the same road. To me, that is actually the most shocking thing. How does this kind of network-based society impact gender discrimination other than through marriage? What is going on there?
So marriage is, obviously the sort of instrument that keeps it perpetuating. So it becomes perpetuating. But control over women's bodies, their options, are very strongly correlated to where the women are in terms of their caste hierarchy. People need to understand that when we talk about Indian women, and of course, there are many, many common barriers that all Indian women or all women, not just Indian women, all women face everywhere. But I think the options are very strongly differentiated by where one lies in the caste hierarchy. Having said that, of course, I must emphasize that there are women like the two of us here on the podcast where there is a small group that is small in proportional terms but large in numerical terms, because any small proportion of 1.6 billion ends up being a large number of people that have, because it might be through education, because of anti-caste reformist practices that have happened in several parts of the country, not recently, but in the previous century, have had a role to play in creating a sort of a slightly progressive outlook that has led to endorsement of girls' education, letting girls do what they want. So I think it's important for listeners to also realize that, because I don't want to give the impression that it's just a complete state of darkness with no light at all. And I mean, I come from Maharashtra, for example, that has had very significant social reform movement, and not, I mean, that of course in the 19th century, but also when you go back to the Bhakti movement of the 8th and the 9th centuries, which were very strong, anti-Brahmanical, very progressive, egalitarian movements with a huge, very literature, poetry, and which many, 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 many Maharashtrians genuinely believe in. So the Bhakti poetry informs a lot of the way Maharashtrians would think about women or about the role of women or about caste even. So that's important. And Maharashtra is not far from the only state in India that has had these kinds of anti-caste. Tamil Nadu is one. West Bengal, several parts of India have historically had very strong anti-caste egalitarian movements that have targeted patriarchy and caste oppression together. So that's just sort of putting that on the table. Having said that, that's still not the majority. And for the majority of women, the higher up they are in the caste hierarchy, there are greater constraints on the choices they make, primarily because it's a question of honor and it's a question of property. It's plain and simple. That is an issue. Even though, if you think of legislation, for example, changes in the Hindu Succession Act that allow now women to inherit property. So there have been a lot of legislations in the right direction, but I think it will be a while before you start feeling the impact of those changes on the ground in terms of greater equality in terms of property ownership. So I would say asset ownership or property ownership remains one of the biggest areas where you have male-female disparity, even in communities where girls study well, etc. But property ownership still remains a big, and as long as that's the case, there will be restrictions on who the girls are going to marry, because it's, at the end of the day, it boils down to sharing wealth and sharing property.
We're talking about caste being the embarrassing thing about India and the dark picture. The other is female labor force participation. I mean, it's the numbers are just horrifying. They are now in the mid-teens. Some people say the low teens, because there's a problem in the way the data is capturing the information. This whole time, so there are 2-3 things going on with female labor force participation. There was this big feeling when liberalization happened that as the structural transformation happens and India grows richer, right, there are going to be more women in the workforce. That didn't quite exactly pan out. And the economist response to that is there is a U-shaped curve. So as communities get richer, first women drop out of the labor force because, for most people, the household income has gone up. So now they feel like they can make that trade-off. Children should be raised by the woman in the house if it's a cultural preference. In India, of course, it's this honor income trade-off, right? The woman can stay at home and we can preserve the honor. And then the U-shaped curve is as you get further down the development path and as you get really rich, then you're going to see more and more women like you and me, for instance, right? Those who got educated and have the ability to work. And work is, not just because you have to support your family. It's also a means to other ends and it's a form of agency and so on. So where is this U-shaped curve playing out in India the way we think it plays out in other parts of the world? Is there something else going on in India? Like, why is there this war against women in the labor market?
Again, a long question that has several parts to the answer. So, first, don't see the evidence of a U shape in the way that is being argued for other countries in the world, in India. Where you see the U shape is with education. So, the highest female labor force participation rates are either illiterate women or highly educated women. And that also puts a question mark on A, the income effect story, and B, this honor income trade off that gets talked about a lot. I have a lot of skepticism about that argument because if you look at the honor income trade off story, then is the honor so called is when we talk about the poorest women or when you talk about so the middle income women. One of the issues that I have with a lot of commentaries on India's female labor force participation rate is that people confuse the low levels with the decline. Okay. So I think that they are related, but they are separate phenomena. So even at its very peak, the recorded female labor force participation rate in India did not exceed 40%. So it remained at 36, 38. Now, when you look at ethnographic accounts of, village studies done by sociologists, anthropologists, if you travel by train, if you travel by bus, you see fields, you see, travel through villages, that 30, 40, whatever percent figure, that the low level I'm talking about now, and doesn't square with the visuals of women working in fields, doing small things, bustling about. Pune is a city where a lot of my family lives. If you came to Pune, you would not believe that it has such a low female labor force participation rate because you see women bustling about everywhere, right? And so, what's going on there, right? I mean, I'm not talking about Pune, but I'm just talking about the Indian story. And there, on the low level question, a big component of that low level is that family enterprises, and this includes farming, run on the back of free labor provided by women. These are economic activities. I'm not talking about care and childcare and cooking and cleaning and all the rest of it, right? So these are activities that when a man does them, they are counted in the GDP, and the man is counted as a worker. But when the woman does them, she's not counted as a worker. A large part of the low level is explained by the fact that unpaid economic activities of women are not counted, and these women are not counted as workers. So, my submission to you is that many more women are workers if you count working in activities for pay and profit, if that is counted as a definition of work, which is what the ILO uses. So, I think that's an issue that needs to be fixed. And this is not to count their care work hours and
I
all that.
agree. But on this,
yeah.
I have a question. How much is the level affected by this?
My work with Naila Kabir, where we did a primary survey in West Bengal, we actually calculated the difference. So our survey was in 7 districts of West Bengal, which using the NSS data for that time, these 7 districts had a labor force participation rate of 18 or 20, I forget exactly what. Just counting these economic activities, our labor force participation rate estimate for these 7 districts is 56%. That's the order of magnitude difference and this is not expanding the definition of work. We take the strict economic, GDP definition of work. Okay, so that's one thing. The other question is the decline now. I could go on talking about this, but let me stop here. Now let's come to the decline. I think we need to understand when the decline started, where it is happening before we put forward theories about them. If you believe NSS data, as I do believe NSS, the decline started in 2004. According to NSS data, the decline is a rural phenomenon. Within rural, it is a phenomenon that affects Adivasi women. So it's really a decline that shows up for rural ST women. If you believe NSS. If you don't believe NSS, if you believe CMI, there's a decline in both urban and rural. All right. Anyway, they don't go back that much. They only started in 2016. So from CMI, we'll never know what happened earlier because CMI did not collect data on employment. So we have to use NSS, whether we like it or not. Now, when we think of the decline starting in 2004, then we have to ask ourselves whether the cultural explanations that are very popular in the ecosystem, particularly amongst economists who've discovered culture after having neglected culture. Now it's everything is culture. So about 2004 India, seriously, Are there cultural factors that particularly disadvantaged rural Adivasi women in a way that led them to withdraw from the labor force? Does that sound like a plausible explanation? Or does the fact that,
Narega.
well, Narega, they get counted as workers, so Narega is not it. Narega is not it. The famous jobless growth period coincides really with the 2004-5. And I have a graph, which unfortunately this is not a video, otherwise I would have shown you. I've tweeted that graph earlier, where you see the rise in the population that's eligible for jobs, that is a working age population, and the curve that is employed people that starts diverging from 2004. So what's really happening is that as the job scarcity is increasing, women are getting disproportionately impacted by the job scarcity. And I have two separate papers in which I show the effect of demonetization and the COVID lockdown. Both of those disproportionately impacted female labor force participation. So the real story is that when jobs are scarce,
Women get thrown out.
women get disproportionately impacted.
Yeah. So, I want to get into this, the stuff you did on COVID and demonetization. On this, what you find is actually quite remarkable, because this entire time, whether it is culture or whether it is, income honor trade-off or so many other things like, public safety, motherhood, care work, all these explanations are about the supply side of women's labor supply not being forthcoming. Even when I said Narega for Adivasi women, for me, that was a supply side explanation, that if now one member of the family can qualify for Narega, then, no need for the other person in the family to work, presumably, or they might choose to drop out of the labor force and so on, right? So all these are in some sense supply side explanations. What you find is quite remarkable, that it's actually a demand side story. In this demand side story, it sounds like very classic discrimination. Now, is this productivity-based discrimination, skill-based discrimination, or is this just gender prejudice?
When you think of the drop in rural areas, other than agriculture, for women, avenues of employment are practically non-existent. I mean, you can be a school teacher, you can be a nurse in the primary healthcare center, but that about sums it up. Asha workers, Anganwadi workers, ANMs are fighting for years to be classified as full-fledged government workers, and that's not happened yet. I mean, and paid, which is a real tragedy. So, I mean, if you just increased proper employment even through these three channels, that would open up. So I think that women, particularly at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, Dalit women and Adivasi women, get particularly hit because when they are not, their families don't own as much farmland as upper caste families would do, right? So for them, other than fisheries, if you live near water or whatever, the options of rural Dalit or Adivasi women to engage in economically productive work, if their family enterprises are going through a crisis, if their men have migrated, are very limited. Rural areas, gender discrimination, yes, maybe, but I think it's more about just no avenues for these women. My colleague Kanika Mahajan's work shows that mechanization that happened in the period exactly that I'm talking about, 2004, etc., the kind of mechanization that happened substituted more for agricultural tasks that were dominated by women, seeding, sowing, and implanting, and things like that, and or plucking the sort of smaller harvest season, etc. So technological change disproportionately disadvantaged women in rural India exactly at the time when you see a decline in rural female labor force participation rate. And in urban India, one is, we talked about the absence of sort of a social network, welfare services. And that's the reason why in urban India, women have always had a lower labor force participation rate than rural India, because where do you leave the children? What do you do with your elderly family members, etc., etc. So urban Indian labor force participation rates really, COVID is an exception, but pre-COVID, they hadn't really dropped. They just remained low. So all this, they've always been low and they didn't change. So all this thing of rise in urban crime, etc. Jitendra and I, not in this paper, but elsewhere, we've actually done, fairly robust correlations across countries. And we don't find a correlation between sexual violence against women and their labor force participation rates. Not in India, nowhere else. So yes, sexual violence against women is a
There'll
huge
be some
problem.
substitution, right? Where you choose among the various opportunities, you'll substitute, but the levels won't decline, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, in Delhi, as the resettlement colonies get pushed further and further away from the centers, urban India lives on the backs of, paid labor, so all our sort of domestic services are sort of substituted by paid labor. These women travel huge distances because they need the work. They do need the work, and these are not necessarily illiterate women. They could be middle level educated women, you know. But the point is that, take for example a mobile repair shop in India, you do, or a courier service, which is more or less substituted for the postal service in urban India, certainly. Why can't women be courier delivery people? Now, DHL in India has started now employing women. So I think it also needs, so there is that element of a mindset or gender discrimination where we don't see women as possible
Uber drivers or auto drivers or
Uber
courier
drivers
or,
or
whatever.
deliveries or
Yeah.
couriers or all these sort of middle class in urban areas. In rural areas, it's a different problem. So I think there is a lot of merit to the old fashioned economic arguments of just a paucity of jobs, absence of support services that will allow women to access the jobs that exist, and so on and so forth. Before we jump into the cultural norms, also this honor income trade off. I mean, think about rural Adivasi women. What is the honor income trade off for them? And in my paper with Jitendra, when we document the number of switches that women do, enter and exit the labor, these are the same women. We are following the same women because it's panel data. The number of switches by Dalit and Adivasi women is the highest. So every 4 months, you see them entering and exiting. Not every woman, but our data is every 4 months, which means that when they do get a job, they are working.
Is the honor income trade-off more about like how certain castes are trying to be more and more Brahminized, as they call it, right? They're mimicking certain kinds of features or restrictions on women because that's what the uppermost castes have historically done. Is there any merit to that?
There could be. And, you do, I've seen that like on the field trips that I've been, you see the spread of, for example, ghungat, veiling, covering your head in castes that earlier never practiced ghungat. Dalits never had historically ghungat, whereas you might see women, OBC women, even more aggressively sporting ghungat than earlier, and so on. So you do see. I'm not an anthropologist, so I would not be the best person to comment on how widespread these changes are, and indeed if they are in all parts of the country or not. I don't know. I only know a few parts of the country where I've done fieldwork. But there is discussion about Sanskritization, including constraints on women and so on and so forth. So whether that translates into preventing a woman from taking up a job when it exists and when she can access it, I think that's a leap of faith. We need evidence to show that. We don't know.
But does it come into your, very first point when we were talking about a self-fulfilling prophecy of how certain cultural codes and norms just make you believe that there is no possibility of anything beyond getting married when you're like 18 or 20. So what is even the point of investing, in high levels of human capital? Like, I mean, is there a reason that doesn't quite work the same way for gender because of caste norms in a way that it works for certain caste stratification?
It doesn't work even for caste. I was explaining to you Arrow's model, but on the ground, as we saw, students don't internalize these biases. They want to study, they want to.
Yeah, but do women,
neither
is
do
my
women.
question.
Neither do women. So if you look at the expansion of higher education in India, precisely during the period when you see a fall in women's labor force participation rate, expansion of women in higher education, which means leaving home, traveling long distances, battling all those prejudices and cultural factors and stares and groping, all the uncomfortable experiences that are supposed to prevent women from accessing jobs, or that are supposed to be leading their families to tell them, no, you can't work because you'll meet strange men, you will be groped on the bus, etc., etc. But this very same woman went to college, which was far away from her home. She took public transport, she went there. Whether she fought inside the home or her parents allowed her, we don't know, we'll not know. But the fact is, the numbers are showing that women are going to college.
In absolute terms, women are going to college. But, for instance, like Girija Borkar's work shows that women change. They have to incur a higher cost, right? They have to either spend more money or spend more time to take the safest route to get to college or to get to the place of work relative to a man. So there is a certain cost that women bear because of their gender, but it may not, as you say, turn into a trade-off that actually affects, levels at the workplace or something like that.
Yeah, I don't doubt the cost at all. But the fact is it leading Indian women to say, okay, I'm not going to go to college because the streets are not well lit, or I don't have a bus connection. They'll wait for hours because that's their also chance to get a. This final thing
That's the
before
other part of it. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. The other thing is that we now have in India a phenomenon of, what is it, educational hypogamy, which is women on average are more educated than their husbands, which was not the case 20 years ago. Second, total fertility rate in India has declined. It's now at replacement. Urban is 1.8, total is 2.1,
Yeah.
rural is 2.2 or
Yeah, which means
2.3 or
some of this
something.
motherhood supply side factor can't be the explanation, right? So
That's one. The interstate, inter or community variation in all of these
it's
things is
converging.
converging very fast. Educational gaps, male, female, are converging very fast. Again, the community differences, etc., are narrowing, and so on. Maternal mortality rate significantly dropped in India. All of these factors, Shruti, are factors where elsewhere in the world were sort of the base factors for female labor force participation rates to rise, right? Now, unless you argue that Indian people are sort of wired strangely and Indian society, Indian people are not like the rest of the world, which I don't buy at all. I mean, we are all people, we are all human beings. We have to look for alternative explanations other than cultural explanations for why we are not seeing absorption of this increasingly educated female human capital power that lies in our country. I think we are losing out. I mean, India is losing huge amounts of potential additions to GDP by not absorbing the productive potential of Indian women, which is abundant.
I mean, there are some things that could be done on the margin, even on the demand side, which have to do a little bit with the supply side. So, for instance, I've seen recent literature. This is work by Ashish Sedai. He's talking about access to indoor piped water or access to electricity, how that improves the status of women relative to men, but through employment opportunities for two reasons, right? One, there is a reduction of time allocated in the household task, but more importantly, they're more reliable. If there isn't piped indoor water, that means you're using some strained source of water. Your kids fall sick more, which means you might live in a community where women take more sick days. And so employers just don't want to employ women. But if you're a community that gets indoor piped water or gets electrification, then the norm changes because now women take the same number of sick days as men, which means employers are not going to not hire women at all, or, are in fact more likely to hire women, if the jobs open up and so on. So there is something to do with, public goods provisioning and things like that. But you're right in that they can't be this simple, straightforward, women's supply of labor has dried up. I think you're right that we need to walk away from that kind of a simple theory of what's happening in India.
Because, if as long as you continue to believe that, then there's nothing to be done, no? I mean, there's obviously some cultural factors have taken over, and Indian women have just decided, okay, we can't work anymore. Okay, then end of story then, right? It isn't the end of the story. So, of course, having talked about economic factors, I must mention one cultural norm, by the way, which definitely needs changing in India, South Asia, is the norm that places almost the exclusive burden of domestic chores on women, whether the women do it themselves or they get it done.
Yeah, it's all women.
It's all women. And it's not just it's of course it's a huge commitment of time, but it's also a huge commitment of headspace.
Yeah. And you showed this in your COVID work, right? That was a clean break. Like you can do a very nice experiment where both men and women are at home. And somehow magically still it's women doing, I mean, the first couple of weeks the men chip in and then it just disappears.
By the time you reach December 2020, men, according to CMI, are doing even less than they did before. It's like done it for 1 month and that's it. Our quota for our life is over. So I think their messaging, incentives, role models. I mean, again, to think that any one policy is going to change any of this is obviously not. So, for example, this very important provision of electricity, water, and pipe gas or LPG cylinders. All of these are very good examples of policies that should be promoted to reduce time on domestic chores, and it is also gender neutral. I mean, men can operate these things too,
Yeah.
certain companies are doing some, fabulous advertising campaigns like Ariel, the washing detergent. They've started this hashtag share the load.
Yeah.
And so they have these beautiful ads, but these reach a very small
Yeah, the
segment
top
of urban.
1% sort of, I mean,
Yeah,
these are for us. We are mimicking the
these are for
West,
us.
and we are even there, they're not sharing the load exactly, but they pretty much only work for people like us, right?
Yeah, yeah. But I do feel that, the conversation on sharing domestic chores,
Yes, is an
and that it's
important one.
everybody's job, I think it's an important one and it must be aggressively pushed.
Yeah, and that norm setting has to happen at every level. It can't just happen, in the labor force conversation, right? Has to happen in school, it has to happen in kindergarten, it has to happen as older sisters are looking after and doing the care work when there are younger brothers. I mean, it's like this is a more complicated thing than it looks like at first brush. It's not just about loading the washing machine.
No, in fact, there's an ad hoarding. There's this scheme called, not scheme, but a slogan more than a scheme, called "Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao," which is an
Yeah.
excellent slogan, which is educate the daughter, save the girl child. So obviously we all believe in this idea. But on my way to work, I pass a hoarding for this particular slogan, where the girl child is shown in the kitchen making rotis,
Yeah.
making bread, right? Now, obviously, I would like to believe that it was unintentional. However, what is the message that that hoarding is giving us? Unconsciously, it's saying we need to save the girl child because we want her to work in the kitchen. I don't think that's the reason.
No, and the narrative
Yeah.
is if you educate the girl child, you'll have your next generation will be better educated because the mother will teach the kids or help them with their homework or something. It's not really to absorb that human capital in the labor market. So there's something very funky going on.
Yeah. So I think they're messaging the conversation, and the current government has such a massive majority, and it has the ear of the people. I would really, if they could just give the right kind of messages about gender equality inside the home, it would have a tremendous reach.
I do agree. Some norm setting is always helpful. I want to go back to our reservation discussion. My main critique of the reservation policy in India is actually has nothing to do with merit and stigma, which is, the usual grouse. My argument is actually twofold, and this is not against reservation per se, but it's more about how we've done it. So one is, the Ambedkarite vision or started with reservations for Dalits and Adivasis because of historical oppression and discrimination, right? And then, of course, we've moved quite far from that. There is the Mandal movement, which is the first step away. And, it becomes a Dalit Bahujan movement. I don't want to get into the tension of that movement, but at that time, there were many Dalits who felt that people who were caste Hindus and part of systematically oppressing them, like just 50 years before, are now being included in the same group as them. But leaving that aside, then you have like states like Tamil Nadu, which break the Mandal rule, which exceed, the above 50% through the 9th schedule and stuff like that. And now we have this 103rd constitutional amendment, which is actually further breaking the link between historical oppression, discrimination, and reservations, right? So now it is social and economic backwardness and not just. And your work shows that as we keep adding more and more groups to be eligible for reservation policies, the newer groups the problem is not just that they're not historically oppressed, it's that even within those groups, the beneficiaries are not the poorer ones, right? It's always the rich elite jats or the kapus or the patidars who are getting the benefits of these. So, that is one problem that I have with not reservation policy per se, but how we have conducted this. And related to that is, I mean, the entire goal was to annihilate caste, right? And it seems like what we've done is constitutionalized caste, right? The process by which we are tagging on more and more people to get these benefits is not helping us make them lose their caste identity. It's the opposite. It's like the benefits are linked to their caste identity. So from the moment the child is born, the first thing you do is get them the SC, ST or OBC certificate. And then that's the perpetuation. If you were the one who was designing this from scratch today, what is a good way to think about this problem in a way that we are not strengthening caste identities?
One of the reasons why this is a complicated issue is we think we have now designed the reservation policy as the only quote unquote magic wand that is supposed to solve all manners of caste disparity. As long as we think of reservations as a solution to caste inequalities, it is going to reach a dead end, as it does often. And the demand from additional groups into the reservation, sort of on the reservation train, is linked to what we were talking about earlier, which is just the demand for good jobs. So I think a lot of problems are getting articulated when people demand reservations or to be included in the reservations group. And somehow we think that, okay, if we just add one more group to this shrinking pie, that problem is going to be magically solved. So I think we have to disentangle the problems faced by various communities and then address them. So I definitely believe that the original Ambedkarite vision, which was a limited time to create a level playing field so that you have equality of opportunity, which could lead to inequality of outcomes. That's a separate matter. But the focus should be on equality of opportunity. And while Ambedkar might have phased it for college level education, if you think of equality of opportunity as the main focus of the policy, then you must make sure that there's equality of opportunity at every level. So it doesn't mean a quota, but it means that the kinds of schools that children go to in rural India, the kind of health facilities that they have, everything that makes, 0 to 5, the early childhood years,
Your source
are
of water and your chance of survival. Like sometimes it's so basic.
the cradle of adult life disparities is actually 0 to 5, early childhood. So if you think of equality of opportunity as the guiding principle of policy, then you will make sure that in addition to giving reservations at the college level, you will equalize opportunities at all of these steps. If that had been done, then we could have talked about reservations being redundant after, say, 15 to 20 years. I think that's how Ambedkar envisaged it. Unfortunately, reservation is seen as the beginning and the end of, now we've given reservations, whether they come in, they sing, they swim, it's just a mechanical policy that everybody has to follow. Coming to the other communities, there is, I think, a genuine discontent and a genuine anxiety about stable livelihoods, particularly from agrarian communities. We've looked at Jats in Haryana, we've looked at Marathas in Maharashtra, Patels in Gujarat. We've looked at their demands, we've looked at their socioeconomic outcomes in a variety of dimensions. My work with Rajesh Ramachandran, and these three communities in their respective states even do better than the legal OBCs right now. So based upon any indication of backwardness, there is no justification for these communities to be included in the reservation bandwagon. But because of the crisis in Indian agriculture, because of the anxieties that our children may not get a good job, and this, so and so in the village is going to get a reserved category job, and even if it's just one person, it's seen as something that makes for the myth of reservations giving jobs. So reservations doesn't create employment.
Yeah. It's a tiny fraction of the total workforce. I mean, it's irrelevant.
It's irrelevant. Actually, when you think of the total number of jobs, and if you think of what number of proportion of jobs is impacted by reservations and the reserved category, it's a tiny fraction. So, but look at the fight over that little tiny fraction.
But is it because there are certain groups, I mean, we know that from liberalization, everyone benefited, but the upper caste, English-speaking service sector groups, especially urban, benefited the most. So is this a feeling that their rural counterparts, the high status landowning rural counterparts, never got those benefits from liberalization? And in some sense, they got left behind, right? Because we never liberalized agriculture. That rural structural transformation that was supposed to happen never really happened. And our land sale laws are such, so terrible that they couldn't quite exactly monetize their biggest asset. Their children are not well educated. So is this where that anxiety is really stemming from, that they didn't benefit from the structural transformation?
That is one. The other is with the entry of big corporations into agriculture. So while on the one hand,
Yes,
there isn't a land market and we haven't monetized agriculture, but on the other hand, there are these big, fear of corporate takeover. It's a very real fear.
Yeah, and so your bargaining power has now completely changed as opposed to your high status before. Yeah.
Look at the farm laws. Look at the anxiety that got exhibited through the agitation. So whether it is justified, not justified, is that the solution or not? I'm not going into that. I'm not an expert on those topics. But the point is that the fear of a corporate takeover, along with losing out relative to your urban counterparts, that status doesn't count for much, because sarkari naukri is sarkari naukri, and you see some little, boy from a Dalit family who's in the city having a sarkari naukri. It brings in stable income every month. You see the protests on the Agniveer. I mean, all of this Agniveer scheme, all of this is
Is
a
a
jobs
jobs
problem.
problem. Absolutely. I saw the graph you tweeted after the Agniveer. We'll try and pull
Yeah,
that up when we link the transcript, and it's extraordinary. I mean, there's no way this scheme is going to plug the hole. There is no government jobs program that is going to plug this hole. So we just
exactly.
have to create jobs in the Indian economy, and the crux of whether it is women, whether it is caste discrimination, whether it is upper caste anxiety, everything finally seems to be a labor problem in India, right? That's what it's boiled down to.
It's a very big, and we talk about our youth dividend. We should, by the way, talk also about our gender dividend, because I think
Yeah.
women embody in themselves huge amounts of productive potential, especially after the expansion of education. And I think we are losing out, the Indian economy is losing out because we are not utilizing our educated workforce, young people, women who could be in the workforce and contribute.
And also, I think, we think of jobs as the end, but actually the jobs are also the means of building human capital further. So it's a missed opportunity both in harnessing the human capital and also building it further. So it's like two missed opportunities, right? Which is really like kind of frightening how bad things are. But on the depressing note, I want to move to like some happier topics.
Okay.
And one of the happier topics is our common love for Bollywood movies, right?
Yes.
It seems that yours is very much rooted in music, which seems to be the same for me. Like, I know more Bollywood songs and I know songs from movies, everything about those songs, and I haven't even seen those films. So, for me, it's very much rooted in a music of a particular kind. So, where is this coming for you? Is it also the music, or is it both the movies and the films?
Music and the films. So, when I was a child, watching Hindi movies was not considered things that, cultured people do. It was very infra dig. But my father, who was a very unusual person, was, both from my father's side, the whole family was, crazy about the movies. And my father had absolutely no qualms about taking us to movies. My classmates used to be shocked that we went with our parents to watch. So my father had this classification, which I really like. He said there are four kinds of films. There are the good films, there are the good, bad films, there are the bad, good films, and there are the bad, bad films. Right? And so his point is that the good, and the good bad. Good are, your Satyajit Rays and, you're the art cinema. And the good bad is, say a Manmohan Desai blockbuster, which is it's a bad film, but
Yeah.
it's a really good
Good,
bad
bad
film.
film. I agree.
Yeah, so his point is, you guys must be exposed to both the good, which also we watched a lot of, but also the good bad. And the category that he hated the most were the bad good films, like the films that are giving a message, or some arty film that is so boring that, so his point is, I'd much rather you watch a Govinda film than watch some, arty farty film with a message which
NDFC,
is
depressing thing. Yeah.
boring, whatever. So as a result, I grew up watching movies at a time when my classmates were absolutely shocked that I was watching all those movies. And the music. I absolutely, the music of the golden era of the Hindi films, which is 1950s to 1970s, is my most favorite music, other than Hindustani classical, which also
Which is
I'm a
reflected
big,
in that
big fan.
time, actually. So that's not surprising.
It's not. I mean, it's difficult to separate the two. And so I absolutely, that's my kind of go-to music for all times. And as I say, not just me, it's not, I didn't invent this, but basically from that era, there's a Hindi film song to describe every possible human emotion. Whatever micro, minute feeling that you're feeling, there will be a song that will describe exactly that. So that's why it's so enriching and so fulfilling.
So, one of the things I mean, we recently lost Lata Mangeshkar, and she was sort of the last person from that Nehruvian era, the immediate, all the hope that came with the post independence movement. And she kind of lasted till post liberalization, right? So, what is it about Lata Mangeshkar that we think about or we care about, or what does that icon really mean?
So I gave a talk recently in Delhi on the music of Lata Mangeshkar and the idea of India. Basically, the best way to understand what Lata stood for is to read Nasreen Munni Kabir's book, Lata Mangeshkar in her own voice, right? Because as with all superstars, there's a lot of mythology surrounding the individual. You know, Lata Mangeshkar was all too human with all the human strengths and weaknesses that we see any person, right? What I want to argue is that she was an extremely independent woman with her own thoughts and ideas. She shaped her own life, not caring so much for social approval. She comes across as an intelligent, smart, thinking woman who's capable, who makes decisions for herself. And and how, she was a reigning superstar in the film industry. Now, I know that there's been a lot of discussion of her friendship with Bal Thackeray, and my answer to that is, tell me any famous person from the Bombay film business or cricketing fraternity that wasn't friendly with Bal Thackeray. In any case, in their case, it went back to their families. Like her father and the Thackeray family were known to each other. Other than that, in her personal life, she made friends with all kinds of people. Several Muslim artists, and whether they were songwriters or music directors or actors, were extremely close friends of hers. She worked hard on learning Urdu because she wanted to be perfect in her Urdu. And even though when she spoke in her interviews, you could hear a Marathi person speaking, but when she sang, you would not be able to. Her pronunciation was perfect. It shows a respect for other languages other than your own. It shows a respect for other religions other than your own. It's a kind of person that I think all Indians should be, you know, in these aspects. In terms of her virtuosity or in terms of her musical skills, you really need to know a little bit about music to appreciate how phenomenally talented she and Asha Bhosle, by the way, also, how phenomenally talented they are. You take any song of theirs, try to break it down. Now you get these apps where you can slow down a song. I would challenge people to download those apps and play the song in. Then you will be blown away by what they do, what they introduce to those songs. And this is not what the director has told them to do. A genius of that kind needs to be applauded.
So, for me, I agree with your second point much more than your first, in the sense that I agree. I mean, the virtuosity is just unquestionable, right? And also just the riyas and the practice, the commitment that has gone into honing the skill, right? And that's clear. Like, you can't last very long without it. And also, you can't perform that well in that kind of technology, right? You have to be pitch perfect when you're singing live with 70, 80, 100 musicians playing with you and things like that. For me, I feel like sometimes we make too much of Lata Mangeshkar's sort of like that syncretic plural nature, in the sense that she stood for it, not because she was friends with Bal Thackeray. That comes more from the lyrics writers. But she's the voice. And so, for me, the incredible person there is Sahir Ludhianvi, right? Like, he is the syncretic face for me, or Gulzar, right? Or Kefi Azmi. I have somehow always been able to separate the two in my mind, but a little bit too much is made of confusing the identity of the people who wrote the words with her own identity. And that's almost a disservice to her, because she's kind of her own person,
Yeah.
Whereas we've turned her into some kind of Indian melting pot who is like, the thing, all good things must be embodied in this one person.
No.
Whereas they're actually embodied across a very large number of people, the harmony, the unity across like caste, class, whether you're singing about Hindus or Muslims or, things about, whatever is happening with the poor. So that's where I sort of lie on that.
No, I agree with you. But I think in the current atmosphere that India is in, we are seeing two kinds of things. One is, particularly after she passed away, or even when she was alive, there's this huge attack on her from the left, as it were, or from the woke crowd, from, calling her a Hindu, nationalist, and, just dismissing everything about her, which I find is extraordinary given I don't buy the arguments that are made.
Yeah, it's also lack of knowledge, frankly.
It's lack of knowledge. Calling her the epitome of Brahmanical privilege. I mean, give me a break.
She had to start earning for her family at 13. So, I mean, come on, right? And she's not Brahmin. That's the other thing.
Her father was, she's a daughter of a second marriage. Her grandmother was a Devdasi. So, she has a very strong Devdasi lineage. So, you're just even Even when you're showing awareness of these categories, you're being completely blind about this thing.
Yeah, that's like we're imposing a current thought of a very strange kind on a past figure. I mean, I don't care about much about that. I wanted to ask you, like, so what's happening with women in Hindi cinema? Like, is it a better lot for women today? In the sense of roles, I'm not talking about women working in film. So are the female parts better today? Are they worse? Is it a mixed bag in the sense there were always some great female parts written in the past, there were always some terrible female parts, and it's kind of the same. We always have had good and good bad films. I ask specifically because the music I know has declined. I mean, the music has more generally declined, but the number of female songs, the amount women speak or sing, the number of duets, it's all kind of, gone downhill. When you listen to female playback singers these days, they're like, we're lucky if we get 4 lines to sing in a duet. So how do you see this picture evolving in front of your eyes?
So let me answer the second part first, which is I think the big tragedy of Hindi cinema is the almost sort of close to extinction of the Hindi film song. And I think there are two reasons responsible for it. One is the globalization, unfortunately, which is because Western audiences, including Indian diaspora in the West, is used to shorter films under 2 hours. And so sort of the more realistic Hollywood genre of making non-musicals, unfortunately, has pervaded, a Hindi film sensibility, which didn't used to be the case. So one casualty has been the Hindi, as Paromita Vora says now, the song appears at the end credits like as almost as if you're embarrassed to bring it out, like a flashy buaji at a wedding. You don't want the wedding guests to see her. So
I'm going to weddings just for the flashy buaji, so I'm particularly disappointed.
So I'm hugely disappointed by this trend, because I think that the sort of the fake equation of if a film has songs, it is not real is completely misplaced, because every film is a genre. We see Superman movies. I mean, do we believe Superman is real? No. But we believe in the genre, right? And so that's what we are going for. James Bond, for that matter, any of these. There should have been a willingness to accept Hindi film songs through the genre that those films represented. Anyway, rant for another time. I think the demise of the Hindi film song as a genre, it's, relative decline of women versus men. I mean, there could be, but I doubt if that's even a significant question anymore, because I think the song is dying. To me, that's the biggest tragedy. And if it's an item number song, it could be the male voice or could be a female voice. If it's rolling out at the end credits, it really doesn't matter to me.
But I don't buy the death of the musical as the explanation for the quality, the decline in quality. And I'll tell you why. Because there are background scores, right? If you wanted quality music, you could build really great background scores where people are not lip syncing and it's not a standard musical. But the background scores are also terrible. Maybe this is a very elitist opinion, but, so correct me if I'm going a weird way. I think it might be because the reach of Hindi films has increased. Earlier, still a very small elite were watching Hindi films before the advent of television and, the main screen on television, which meant that the people who had access to other forms of entertainment, classical music and things like that were the main patronage to also go watch Hindi film, right? And as that group has expanded further and further, the music is now got more influences, which is a lovely thing. But it has become less, it's lower on the scale of virtuosity, right? There are fewer classical musicians who are part of, the big orchestras, or there are fewer classical musicians who turn composers in Indian films and stuff like that. Is that a good way to think about how the audience has changed?
No, I would say the opposite. I think the real problem is that the elite discovered Hindi films. Things were so much better when the elite was not watching Hindi films. We had songs, we had dances, fairy tale romances, we had so much fun. And now everything has to be realistic, everything has to be short, everything has to be crisp. First, most actors are always abroad, characters in the movies, not actors. Why do they always have to be abroad? Just because now we have a more elite globalized audience that needs to see certain things that they're familiar with. I would say the exact opposite.
So you'd say the opposite.
It's
okay.
Exact opposite. The films of the 50s, 60s and 70s were mass. The music was created for the masses even when it was heavily classically based, So that was the beauty of the film industry of that time, which is that take a medium that is considered elite,
but convert it into a complete
A mass
mass form, And so I credit Hindi film, the trinity of the music director, the lyricist, and the singers for creating this absolutely magical genre of art that was completely mass-based, So I feel like if the elites had stuck to watching their whatever race and whatever, that would have been, we would have at least had our regular movies with songs, Now when I see something like Gangubai Kathiawadi with actual songs, I say, oh, thank goodness there's a song. There are songs in this film,
And the songs are not bad, that's the other thing. Like sometimes, when the songs are bad, you're like, oh, good God, I wish they had made a serious film without any music altogether.
So that's the part of the music, So I'm actually thinking a lot about this, and some of my thoughts may not be very articulate, but I am thinking a lot about what has contributed to the demise of the Hindi film song as a genre, So maybe I'll write something about it.
That'll be lovely. Actually, I've been thinking about something that maybe I'll do a thread on or write something. I was thinking about philosophy in Indian lyrics, right? And there is a subgenre of cabaret songs and club songs and dance numbers, which used to be really philosophical. Right? And I'm talking about like Mud Mud Ke Na Dekh from Shri 420 or Aage Bhi Jane Na Tu from Waqt. I mean, these are songs where like literally the person Waqt, Shashikala is singing the song on stage, right? So it's literally that person, the quote unquote vamp is singing these songs, right? Or Nadra. But that seems to have completely disappeared, where now the club is not a space for any philosophical discussion or like living in the present or an existential question. It's just all like objectification or love or pining or, something like. But once upon a time, even the Nautanki songs asked the existential, like in Sita or Gita, right? The Nautanki song is Are Zindagi Hai Khel. Like that's the song which is asking the great question. So I've been thinking about this a lot. So maybe I'll write something on this.
That'll be great. And even take something like Dil Ka Haal Sune Dil Wala, Seedhi Si Baat Na Mirch Masala.
Exactly.
What happened in Maharashtra recently, Varna Pakad Lega Police Wala,
Yeah.
Sort of a fun song like that.
Absolutely.
So anyway, to come back very quickly to your first question about changing portrayal of women, I mean, I know that ostensibly on the surface, it seems like portrayal of women are more independent. They are smoking, drinking, wearing revealing clothes, having sex before marriage.
Yeah.
All that is great. And, I think that reflects the most of our time. But, just because characters played by Wahida Rahman and Meena Kumari and Madhubala, etc., wore saris or dressed in a more traditional way, it doesn't mean that their characters were devoid of substance.
Yeah, like Rosie is actually more independent than anyone else in modern day film, right? Like in Guide.
Yeah, I'd written a short piece called New Voices in Hindi Film Songs. I really argue that, again, this is a very sort of influenced by Hollywood way of looking at Hindi films, which is, if a woman is wearing trousers and skimpy tops, she's liberated. Whereas if she's in a sari, she's not, And I've given many examples in some other pieces.
Yeah, no, I don't buy that at all. I'm totally on your side on this one. That's a good note to end on, that all these things are complex. It's not easy to paint anything with a single brush. And Ashwini, thank you so much for doing this. I've very long been an admirer of all your work. I feel like I've been reading your stuff for so long and waited to have this conversation with you. So thank you for doing this. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you, Shruti. This was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.